Mr. Chertoff, before I just open it up, can I just ask you about one thing you said about operating seamlessly when faced with the new threats, particularly with the new doctrine for security. Let me put it to you that what we saw at the end of the year in which you left office in Detroit showed, because the president actually had to act and call in all the agencies, how unseamless the agencies which are overseen by the Department of Homeland Security really are. Have they got any better?
Well, I would say if you look at December 2009, and that was about a year after I'd left office, I think it demonstrates one of the challenges of operating a system, which is you have to continuously train it and force the system to operate in a coordinated way. If you don't do that, the agencies will lapse back into their old habits, which is to operate unilaterally. Over the period of time I was in office, we spent a good deal of time really forcing coordinated activity. And actually, I could see over a period of time there was quite a change. But, you know, I had the benefit by 2007, 2008 of a very experienced team in kind of like a football team where everybody's played together a lot and they know what positions they're supposed to take and what the plays are. 2009, you had a brand new team, you had a new president, you had new leadership, and there may have been some reverting back to type. But I think that
has that changed?
I think they learned a lesson. I think it has changed. I think they're much more coordinated now than they were a year and a half ago.
So fewer seams?
Fewer seams, but I don't want to overstate the seamlessness of this. There's always a challenge in dealing with multiple agencies, true in the private sector and in the public sector. But my experience has been the more you exercise it, the better it is.
Please do get the microphone to you. There are microphones. Please get the microphone because, of course, the underpants bomber was known because his father had declared him to the American authorities. That's why I asked the question.
And by the way, that's a classic example of one of the challenges in dealing with sharing information. What's important is that the people who get the information know it's important. And I think in that case, what emerged is that State Department people who received that information didn't appreciate its significance. But part of that is you've got to light a fire under people. Now, when we were in office, you know, the president used to meet with us once a week. So you knew every week you were going to be talking to the president about plots and threats, and that has a great focusing effect on the bureaucracy. And I understand President Obama is now doing the same thing, which I think is going to have the same effect.
Right, let's hear from others in the audience. Again, you are on the record, and so is Mr. Chertoff, please.
Thank you. My name is Kat Callow. I run Project Mosaic, which is a pro-tolerance, anti-extremist charity in the UK, set up in memory of my cousin who was a 9/11 firefighter. My question is about data collection here in the UK, and I am British as well as American. What advice might you have for us in the UK, given the environment in which we exist, where even very well-informed, politically moderate, and opinion-forming members of the public in the UK describe even the presence of CCTV cameras as a dangerous slide towards a police state? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the notion that CCTV cameras are a slide to police state is vastly overstated. There's a far cry from recording things, particularly if after a couple weeks, you expunge it if it becomes irrelevant, and actually having a police state. I can tell you anecdotally, in Chicago, they have CCTVs all over the place. And I asked Mayor Daley once what the public reaction was, and he said, well, we started to put it in a few communities and it reduced crime. And then we went to each community and we said, do you want CCTVs or not? If you don't want them, we won't put them in there, but you understand a lot of the criminals may move over to your neighborhood. And everybody wanted CCTVs. The Times Square bombing effort last year demonstrated the value of CCTVs in allowing an apprehension of somebody before they got on a plane to leave the country. So I happen to think that it's compatible with civil liberties and important in protecting us.
Thank you. Sir John.
My name's John Birch. I'm a former member of the diplomatic service, served in the United States and educated in the United States. So I have a great admiration for your country. You described very fluently and eloquently the methods that you use to counter international terrorism. What I think I found lacking was an analysis of the causes of terrorism. Why is it that the United States, which has given so much to the world, is such a beacon of the democracy, has suddenly become, in the last decade, really reviled throughout the world and the target of these attacks. What is it in the assessment of Homeland Security that is the reasons for this animosity, this wish to destroy America and indeed Western society? Why is it? Because it seems to me that unless you have an understanding of the causes, the fight, the measures you take are not going to be effective. And for many of us, even those who just have to travel through JFK, find that many of the measures taken by Homeland Security over the last 10 years have made America rather, we worry about your concepts of justice, the people held in detention, and the amount of snooping and investigation into the lives of ordinary citizens that takes place as a result of all the activities of your agencies and Homeland Security.
Well, first let me say I can tell you that I don't think we're alone in being the target of animosity. I don't think Britain is particularly popular among terrorists, judging from the number of plots we've seen and some of what has been said in the past. I don't think we really fully understand the causes of terrorism, and there may be multiple causes and multiple reasons why this ideology attracts people. You know, there's a certain segment of operatives we've seen that are, you know, what you would expect, disaffected young men who are unemployed, who would maybe be gang members or otherwise engaged in bad activities, and they happen to gravitate to this. But we've also seen a surprising number of medical doctors. When you had the 2007 Glasgow airport attack, those were doctors. Nidal Hassan was a medical doctor. By no stretch of the imagination are medical doctors marginal members of society. The airline plot of 2006, a young couple was, two plotters, a young couple, were going to take their one-year-old baby on the plane and blow it up. It's incomprehensible what motivates this wide variety of people to do these things. There's clearly an ideological appeal, which frankly is not just directed at America. I think it's directed at what are perceived as Western and even Enlightenment values. And I would fully agree we need to understand this and counteract it. And I hope the Arab Spring proves to be a narrative that can counteract it. But if you're suggesting that somehow it's because of things America's done in Afghanistan and Iraq, I can tell you, as you know, 9/11 preceded Iraq and Afghanistan. And why on earth do they keep trying to blow Denmark up? Because of some cartoons. I mean, is it going to be necessary to censor the newspapers in order to avoid these problems? I don't think there's a simple answer. I think it's much more complicated than we've been able to really refine.
But what John Birch is also saying is that really under Homeland Security, when you were in charge, the sense of alienation against America grew because of the policies. He was talking about transiting JFK, or it can happen when you're going through Miami or Los Angeles, that sense of alienation.
I would have to say, well, I can tell you from within the United States, I would have to say alienation, particularly of, for example, the Muslim community, is much less than in Europe. So from that standpoint, I'm happy to stack the American record up against the European record. I also have to say, having passed through quite a lot of borders, putting aside the fact that JFK is an old physical facility, so it's kind of difficult for a lot of reasons when all the planes arrive. I think I've watched the security, and I actually see it's pretty straightforward. You know, they take your fingerprints. You normally spend about a minute with the border inspector. Sometimes you get pulled into secondary, but candidly, I've seen that when I come into London or other places as well. So I'd have to say that I would take issue with the idea that the way we conduct security is causing a major problem in terms of alienation.
Over there, please.
Yes, thank you very much for a truly, I
Could you
think,
introduce yourself?
required reading presentation. The name is Ewan Grant. I'm a Customs and Border Security consultant, formerly an intelligence analyst in UK Customs, and I have experience in West Africa and Yemen. My question is based on your point about the need to keep the pressure on to keep it as seamless as possible. Are you satisfied that, obviously that takes a lot of effort, are you satisfied that the law enforcement agencies have enough incentives at all levels to give confidence to staff that if they follow leads and make sure people are talking to each other, that they will be supported? Because I have seen, admittedly some years ago, where that has not been the case, and people are accused of not focusing on their own work. I would just finish off by saying I think your point about AQIM and the West African drug traffickers, I think, is increasingly extremely timely, not least in relation to the possible fate and destination of the non-Arab mercenaries of Colonel Gaddafi. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would say to your question, the answer is yes and no. I think that there is, although sometimes it waxes and wanes, a fair amount of drive and incentive to be energetic in following leads and in counterterrorism. Although there are times that, particularly in a period of budget stress, that there's some pulling back. I think there's a greater danger, though. There's a little bit of a tendency for the politicians to send the operators out, say, be very aggressive. I mean, that's what happened after 9/11. I mean, literally, members of Congress said, take the gloves off. Why did you not get rid of bin Laden before? Why did you not take care of this before? And sure as the sun rises in the east, once the threat is averted and things have died down, and the very same politicians call on the operators and say, why did you do that? What an outrage. And that, I think, is very, very damaging. I fear we are now in an environment where we're back to increasing cautiousness and concern about not doing anything that's out of the ordinary because of fear of retaliation. And if that winds up being the case, and there's another attack, then I can predict, like the sun's going to rise in the east, that there'll be another 9/11 commission, and we'll hear, why did you get so conservative? Why were you so cautious? Getting political leadership that gives clear direction and then stands behind the people they send out into the field is, I think, the indispensable requirement of doing the job properly.
Hi, Maury Shank, among other things, advisor at Steptoe & Johnson, where I work with your DHS Assistant Secretary Stuart Baker.
Right.
I want to ask about cybersecurity. In physical security, there seems to be a relatively well understood set of trade-offs with civil liberties, security, convenience, cost, et cetera. In cyber, it seems to me we barely know where to start. Do you agree with that? If so, what can government do to help?
I think we do know where to start. I just think it's really complicated to figure out how to finish. Part of the problem is, unlike in the area of physical security, in cyber, most of the actual work of securing our non-governmental systems is going to have to be done by the private sector. The government can guide them, can give them information. I'm not a believer the government ought to be sitting on the internet controlling everything that goes in and out. I think that's a bad idea. But that means the private sector has to protect its assets. And the market does not always, the market sometimes fails in creating the incentives to do that, because sometimes the value of the asset is not worth a heavy investment of security. And yet if the asset fails, all the depending assets that are owned by other people will fail as well. You see that with the power grid. So part of the challenge is to break the problem down. I mean, we saw this with DHS. If you just talk about the problem writ large, it becomes hopeless. So you take pieces of it. I can tell you now there are things you could do that would eliminate 75 to 80% of the threats. Not the most serious, but some of the ones that are the biggest nuisance. And it'd be quite straightforward. And if you did that, then we could spend a lot of time on the other 25%. So there is a way forward, but I do think that you're going to have to be systematic about breaking it down and dealing with one piece of it at a time.
Can I just ask, how smart and aware is the private sector in particular about the scale of the cyber threat? You obviously have a commercial interest in giving a particular answer on this
Right.
one, but what's your assessment of how really they understand how insidious this is?
It varies. If you look at the newspapers, there's been a lot of reporting lately about various kinds of intrusions, some well publicized and with serious economic damage. I mean, we've seen a lot of companies having to pay out, because of data that was stolen. So I think awareness is increasing. Again, I think the challenge is that the security people, here's what I think the biggest problem is. The security people who are engineers love to talk about the technology and the software and the security and the systems, but they're not necessarily good at figuring out how that actually works with real people who are not technologically oriented geeks. The social scientists and the people who are making the policy are good with what motivates people and how you organize people, but they don't really understand the technology. What you've got to do is you've got to bring them together. You've got to know the technology, but you've got to make it work in a way that human beings actually will interface with, rather than something that you have to be someone who's in love with computers in order to implement.
At the back, please.
Kunal Datta from The Independent on Sunday. Can you tell us how where you were on 9/11 and
Yes.
how you as a person have kind of changed over the last 10 years? And I was also interested, there's a recent WikiLeaks cable that talked about Pakistan sharing more information with the US government. Just interested to how much the relationship between America and Pakistan has changed over the last 10 years.
Improved relations since when are you talking about there? How recently?
This was before 9/11. This was 19.
Okay.
19.
So I was the head of the criminal division at the Department of Justice, which is like your director of public prosecutions. And I was about to arrive at my office. I was on the telephone, and my deputy said a plane just crashed in the World Trade Center. And like many people, I thought it was a private pilot who'd made a terrible error. And then he was watching television. He said a few moments later, a second plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, and we realized it was an attack. And in those days, before there was a Department of Homeland Security, the operations were run out of the FBI Operations Center. So I immediately went there. Bob Mueller, who's the director of the FBI, an old friend of mine, was there. And we began the process of trying to figure out who had done this and how to prevent further attacks. And I spent the next weeks practically living at the Operations Center as we put together a picture of who had carried out the hijackings, but more important, who might be left that was planning another wave of attacks. As far as Pakistan is concerned, and I would say for me it was a transformative event. I mean, I had dinner with Ted and Barbara Olson the Saturday before 9/11. And I remember Barbara Olson saying to everybody at the dinner, "Oh, I'm going to go to California on Tuesday to do something on Fox News." And of course, she died on that day. So it was a transformative event for me on a personal level, as well as obviously as a citizen. As far as Pakistan is concerned, it's been a challenging relationship. In many instances, we've had tremendous cooperation. In some, there have been maddening and frustrating cases where things weren't done that should have been done, or information got leaked, or we tried to do something and it was frustrated. This may not be politically incorrect to say, I think President Musharraf was actually pretty good as a friend to the U.S., but there are certainly elements within Pakistan that are not friendly, and there's a lot of public animosity to the United States. What needs to happen is for Pakistan to become convinced that its own future as a democracy should not allow it to tolerate elements inside the country that are extremist. You can't flirt with the devil. You can't, on the one hand, encourage people to commit acts of terrorism in, let's say, India, and on the other hand, be surprised when they start to turn it on you. And I think that's a challenging issue for the Pakistani establishment.
Can the collapse in confidence since May the 2nd and the killing of bin Laden at Abbottabad, can in any way that be reversed? And do you trust the ISI?
I think there's a lot of understandable skepticism about elements of the ISI. At the same time, I think that, in general, I think the belief is that General Kayani has been a good friend, and some of the leadership, while weak, has its heart in the right place. There's no question, though, it was a blow to the dignity of the Pakistanis, but you must understand a lot of Americans really asked themselves, how could bin Laden have been living in Abbottabad for years without some confidence that he was being looked after by somebody? That's still an unresolved question mark, I think, in the minds of many Americans.
Thank you. You've got the microphone, haven't you? I thought you did.
They were confused between us.
Okay, I beg your pardon. All right, you'll get it in a moment.
Sorry. My name's Sandra Cadorio, Communications Advisor. I just wonder how the US is sort of reconciling the policy of intelligence cooperation and anti-terrorism cooperation with regimes that are hardline, oppressive or undemocratic, like some of those in the Arab Spring, or UK support to Libya has just come to light. Are there red lines in terms of intelligence cooperation with undemocratic regimes? And if there are no red lines, will this come back to bite us later?
I think there are red lines in terms of cooperation. There are some things we wouldn't be cooperating with, hardline dictatorships on. But there's no doubt that there's been some cooperation. So here's the example I'm prepared to give. In World War II, the Allies gave an enormous amount of assistance to Stalin, who in the measure of war criminals and hateful people in history has got to be in the top 2 or 3. And people asked Churchill about how he could be, he was a known anti-communist, how he could be being so eager to help Stalin and the Soviets. And he said, if the devil would join me in fighting Hitler, I would make a few favorable references to him in the House of Commons. It's a tough bargain, but sometimes you do have to deal with unfriendly regimes. I will tell you that Secretary Rice, I think in 2007, went to Egypt and spoke pretty openly and with some negative reception by the government about the need for them to open up and be more democratic and have more of the rule of law. And I think part of what we need to do is strike that balance between the cooperation we need, but also encouraging movement in the direction of greater freedom and respect for the rules.
How comfortable do you feel, given what has emerged in the last 48 hours from the intelligence headquarters in Tripoli, about the level of relationship between Libyan intelligence, MI6, CIA? This must have been argued over when you were head of Homeland Security.
Yeah, I wasn't in the CIA, so I wasn't really involved in any discussion.
But you must have been aware of it.
Right. I think there was general awareness that in 2002 or 2003, Gaddafi decided he was going to come clean with his nuclear weapons. And as a consequence of that, there was a process of trying to pull him a little bit inside and kind of move him in the direction of, giving up weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. I would say that was I doubt anybody relished doing that, but I think they were, again, trying to be balanced between distaste for Gaddafi and the fact that nevertheless there were a lot of Libyans went into al-Qaeda. It's probably the group, I think one of the largest groups of al-Qaeda fighters came out of Libya, so there's a huge amount of intelligence there.
But again, if I may just press this, on Belhaj, who's now head of the Military Council from the National Transitional Council, obviously this is a major issue here in Britain at this moment, and he was essentially sent to Tripoli, and he spent several years in jail as a result of the relationship between the intelligence agencies. Do you feel, now you're no longer in office, that this was acceptable or is not acceptable and is unlawful?
I don't know anything about the facts of the case. I've been reading a lot of conflicting stories in the newspaper, which are, not particularly enlightening. Nor do I know, although I do read that Belhaj now describes himself really as practically like Thomas Jefferson, and I'm skeptical about whether he's quite as much of a liberal Democrat as he makes himself out to be now. I recognize there are some people in the Libyan resistance or the new group that may be interested in presenting a certain face to the West while they're looking for money and assistance. Time will tell. I think it's really early to reach a verdict on this, to be honest.
James Pettifer. I teach in Oxford University at the moment, but I've been a resident of various periods in Princeton and teach there throughout the last 10 years. When I was resident in Princeton, it was common knowledge that the anthrax envelopes, or some of them, had been posted, I understood, from Princeton Post Office. And I was warned about this almost within 2 days of arriving at the university. Now, this, I think, shows, that the processes of local participation you described can be very threatening, because all sorts of people, I think foreigners in Princeton at that period, were very unhappy at being treated in the way they were by local officials, basically as suspects. And the second question I'd like to ask is, Princeton University and Harvard and other Ivy League colleges, as I'm sure you know, are large markets for Class A drugs because of the wealth in the student body. Now, this in Princeton is supplied mostly by people from Mexico and Guatemala, to my outside knowledge. Now, these people found no difficulty, as far as anyone could see, of moving from Mexico to the US and back again. So are your claims about border security and airports and the general improvement in travel security really, really solid?
So on the first issue, I mean, all I can tell you is that actually some of the anthrax did originate from a mailbox in Trenton. So I'm not aware that there was any particular focus on Princeton as a possible location for the source of this, but maybe it was investigated at one point in time. On the drugs, again, I'm not aware that Harvard and Princeton are particularly central locations for hardcore drugs. Like everybody else in the world, drug importation is a serious problem. I'm not here to tell you that the border is 100% closed. That's plainly not right. Interestingly, it has gotten much tougher to bring drugs into the United States than it used to be because of the border measures we've taken, although far from impossible. The ingenuity, however, of drug dealers is almost boundless. Now they have semi-submersible vessels they use to kind of smuggle in drugs, and then they land them on the coast. Again, it's a back and forth. But I would say that actually it's harder now than it was 5-10 years ago, much harder now to bring drugs and people into the country.
Who's got the... Does someone want the microphone over there? No. Yes or no? Right, down to the front, please. We've got 3 minutes to run, so be quick.
Thank you. Ariel Moutsats from the Mexican Embassy. I would like to know, I mean, there is no question that 9/11 globalized terrorism in the conversation, in the international conversation. We know that cyber threat is also in the conversation, and non-proliferation, but what has to happen for the international community to understand that international crime is a global threat? We've seen what's happening in Mexico, in South America, the violence rates. We know that the United States and the first world has the consumption, so what has to happen?
Nothing should have to happen. I mean, we should realize now that international crime has reached probably a more problematic level than it's been in decades, maybe ever. I mean, the violence, the problem is, there's been a kind of an inflation of violence. That you have beheadings in Mexico. I mean, they're imitating what they see on the internet and on television from terrorists. And that's only going to spread. So I fear that the international community, if they don't recognize it, is going to have a very ugly period of time ahead, and that's going to force the recognition.
Quick last question, 30 seconds, Michael Chertoff. Do you feel comfortable about the measure that the authorities now have of the terror threats around the world 10 years after 9/11 or not?
I think for now I am comfortable. I worry that if we lose focus, we could wind up falling behind because I believe the threat will evolve with a new generation.
And do you believe the political leaderships have the nerve to do what is necessary to make sure any perceived threat is controlled, contained, and maybe eliminated?
I think speaking for the U.S., I think what's interesting is both the Bush administration and the Obama administration have shown a remarkable consistency and continuity in being tough on terrorism, which is a great lesson that notwithstanding partisan squabbling in the U.S., both parties, by and large, the mainstream of both parties believe in tough security.
And which countries are you worried about? Which wobble on this?
I'm a little worried about Pakistan. And of course, if we don't leave Afghanistan in good condition, I would be worried about that.
Michael Chertoff, thanks very much for sparing time here at Chatham House. Thank you as well to those who are watching online, and you can turn your mobile phones on. Thank you all very much indeed, and for the number of questions as well.